Hello, everyone, and happy Thursday. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, Baby Bonds, Building a Brighter Future in Your State. We are so excited to feature baby bonds today in today's webinar. We're going to give people about 30 seconds to a minute more to join, and then we'll officially get things started. Okay, everyone, thank you again for joining us. It looks like our numbers are coming up and that the room is getting fuller. Again, thank you so much for joining us. Today's webinar is called Baby Bonds, Building a Brighter Future in Your State. We have some really good content, techniques, and strategies to share with you all, and we're so excited to get started. So my name is Olivia Harp, and I'm just here to get you all acclimated with the GoToWebinar system before I hand things off to our moderator for today. So just a few housekeeping guidelines. You are muted to ensure sound quality because this webinar will be recorded and emailed to you all within a week from today. We ask that you make sure that you stay engaged throughout the entire webinar. We want to help you as much as possible. So for that reason, we're asking you to use the questions box to ask any questions or share any comments or stories that you want us or any of the panelists to hear. And you'll do that by typing in the GoToWebinar control panel. And if you experience any technical issues, please email us at gotomeeting@prosperitynow.org. So it is pretty cozy and rainy here in the DC area. So we want you to join from a quiet space. I know I have something warm to drink. Feel free to grab a coffee or a snack and get settled in so that you can absolutely get the most out of today. Also engage us again in the questions box and leave comments as you listen. We want to make sure that we hear from you as much as possible and that you're as engaged as possible in today's webinar, and also reflect on ways to apply what you learned to your own work. Everything that we do here at Prosperity Now is for you and to ensure that you can optimize your impact in your communities and your organizations. So thank you again for joining us, and without further ado, I'll pass things off to Shira Markov.
Thanks so much, Olivia. And hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon or morning, depending on where you are in the country. So as said, I'm Shira Markov. I'm Policy Fellow here at Prosperity Now, and I do a lot of work on baby bonds, which is both good and bad this week because it turns out that everybody doing anything on baby bonds, including our webinar, decided to do it in this week. So it's been a really big and exciting but busy week. Here working on baby bonds. The most notable is that the American Opportunity Accounts Act, the federal baby bonds program, was reintroduced this week by Senator Booker and Representative Presley. So hopefully you saw that announcement. You can go to the next slide, Olivia. So before we get into talking about all that, for those of you who might be new to Prosperity Now, just wanted to tell you we are a national nonprofit based in Washington, D.C., and our mission is to ensure that everyone in the country has a clear path to financial stability, wealth, and prosperity. And as a part of that mission, we support baby bonds as a way to ensure that children are set up with the economic resources that they need to build financial stability and wealth when they become adults. On the next slide, you can see we have a very full agenda today. We're talking about a lot of different aspects of baby bonds. But we're going to start off with just the basics of what are baby bonds. We're going to give some highlights from our new legislative toolkit, and then we'll talk about where all the action is happening, the state baby bonds policies that are out there. We're going to have a little bit of a conversation about communicating about baby bonds, and then we will be talking with Jesse Johnson from the Washington Treasurer's Office about what's going on in Washington State. We'll have a call to action, and we'll leave plenty of time for your questions as well, and then we'll wrap things up. So on the next slide, you can see I'm going to be joined by some great speakers today. So Lauren Belor is the Associate Director for State and Local Policy at Prosperity Now. Yumhee Park is Director of Marketing and Campaigns at Prosperity Now, and Jesse Johnson is Outreach and Community Engagement Director for the Office of the Washington State Treasurer. So we can go to the next slide. So for those of you who might be newer to baby bonds or just would like a refresher, I'm just going to give just some basic background before we get too deeply into the conversation. So to think about what baby bonds are and why they're important, on the next slide, I want you to kind of sit back and think for a minute about the arrival of a new baby into the world. This might bring to mind your own child or a grandchild. For me, I think about my nieces and nephews. Other people might think about a close friend's baby. But whoever that baby is, think about what was the feeling when you first saw that baby. I think for me, I always feel a lot of hope and excitement, and it's just such a great time. And you're meeting this new little person in the world who could grow up to be anyone or anything, or at least that's how it feels. But I think, oh, and of course my cat has shown up on cue right when the broadcast starts. So just if you see me pushing someone away, that's my cat. But think about those emotions the first time you saw that baby. And like I said, it's that time of hope and possibility. But the reality is that unfortunately in the US, there aren't infinite possibilities for a lot of babies. Really the economic situation that those children are born into has a really big impact on what their future possibilities hold. So if they're born into a family with lots of wealth, then they're going to, when they become young adults, they'll get help in paying for college or in, kind of getting their first home, and that gives them a financial boost and helps them to get started in life. But if they're from a family that has little wealth or no wealth or even is in debt, which is disproportionately the case for children from Black, Latinx, and Indigenous households, they're not likely to receive that type of support. And that makes it a lot harder for them to get their financial start in life. There's that old saying about it takes money to make money, and it's really true. Without that initial money, those kids are starting way behind, and it's so hard for them to catch up. So that's where baby bonds comes in. So baby bonds are really about changing that reality so that every baby, regardless of their family's financial situation, has a nest egg for their future to help them to reach their full potential. So if you go to the next slide, now I can talk more concretely now that we've kind of got that concept in our head about what baby bonds are. So essentially they're government funded trust funds. It's significant money put aside for children, usually shortly after birth, and those investments are held for the children until adulthood and used for building wealth building when they become adults. So if you think about, a kid from a wealthy family, they get money put aside for them, maybe a trust fund that they can use as adults, and this is essentially the government doing that for kids from households that don't have that ability to put that money aside for the kids. And they're really designed specifically to narrow the racial wealth divide by giving the largest investment to children from households with the least wealth who are disproportionately Black, Latinx, or Indigenous. So on the next slide, you can see this great graphic our comms team put together that shows specifically how baby bonds work. So the government invests a substantial amount of money for each child, as I said, with the largest amount to children from households with the least wealth. And then the government invests that money and it grows over time in value. And then when those children become adults, they can use that money to purchase something that is going to increase their economic security and generate wealth for them, like a home, paying for post-secondary education, starting a business, or saving towards retirement. And the way this works is if we invest in generations of kids and disproportionately giving the largest amounts to kids from households with the least wealth, over time, baby bonds will help to narrow the racial wealth divide. On the next slide, we talk a little bit about what's the potential impact of baby bonds. Now, this is a relatively new concept, or it's not even a new concept, but a relatively new that these programs have started. So we don't have research specifically on baby bonds, but there was a study done that projected if we'd had a national baby bonds program similar to what is being proposed by Senator Booker and Representative Presley, if that had been implemented in the mid-1990s, the impact by the 2015 would have been that the wealth gap would have decreased from white households having almost 16 times the wealth of Black households to having only 1.4 times the wealth of Black households among those participating in the program. And so that's a really, really huge difference that we can see from this program. Now, I do want to be clear that we don't think that baby bonds are the only thing that's needed. We definitely realize people need support now. So we at Prosperity Now support programs like guaranteed income, the expansion of the child tax credit, a strong social safety net, so that people can be supported in having financial stability in the here and now. But we also believe that in order to fundamentally address this wealth gap, we need to make sure that children are set up to succeed and be able to build wealth when they become adults, and that's where baby bonds come in. Now, so we can go to the next slide. So now with that background on what baby bonds are, I'm going to turn to talking about our newest resource, which is the Baby Bonds Legislative Toolkit. So you can see on the next slide, that's the cover and the table of contents for the toolkit, which was published in December. And I know the link is going to be shared in the chat if it hasn't been already, so don't worry about trying to copy down that URL, and we'll also send it out afterwards. So the heart of this toolkit is the Baby Bonds Legislative Template, which I'm going to talk about in more detail in a couple of minutes. But you can also see from the table of contents that it has a background section on baby bonds, which covers a lot of what I just talked about in more detail. There's a section on communicating about baby bonds, so key messages that you can adapt as you're talking to others about baby bonds, and that will be related to what Yamhi is going to talk about in a little while. And there is a section that is the essential elements of state baby bonds policies. So basically, this is a condensed version of the more in-depth explanation of the essential elements of state baby bonds policy that was in the paper that we co-wrote with Derek Hamilton and others at the New School last year. So also encourage you to check out that paper. And then there's a section with other resources on baby bonds and the racial wealth divide in general. So going back to the legislative template, the main reason that we created it is to guide state policymakers and advocates on creating baby bonds legislation that contains all the essential elements that I just mentioned that are needed for strong legislation, but allows them to customize it based on their needs and circumstances in each state. So we're not looking for a cut and paste. This is the legislation just inserted into your own format, but no, we actually want lawmakers to be more thoughtful in developing their own legislation. And what we had seen was as baby bonds were taking off at the state level, there was a lot of copying and pasting going on between states. And while it's great to learn from examples, we also really want to encourage, as we said, the customizing of legislation for each state. And so that's where this template comes in. So on the next slide, you can see that the template is divided into 14 sections that roughly mirror the potential legislation. So I'm not going to go through all 14 of them, but just to give you a little bit of flavor. So there is a section on the program fund that would be created to hold and invest funds. There's a section on agency that would administer the program. It also talks about creating an advisory board or advisory council to guide implementation and including members of impacted communities in that advisory council. There's a section on the enrollment process for the program, as well as a section on program engagement activities to support children and their families in participating in the program, because we do really think that that program engagement is an important component. There's a section on the disbursement process for participants. So how can they get their money? What can they use it for? And then there's also a section on language to make sure that participating children and their families are not impacted in their eligibility for benefits or in their taxes because of participation in the program. So if you go to the next slide, here we give kind of a sample of what the legislative toolkit looks like. So, you know, as I said before, it's really, this toolkit is about identifying what's critical to be addressed in the legislation and then providing guidance or considerations around each of them. So we really want to encourage legislators to engage in a thoughtful process, ideally including conversations with impacted communities as they're developing this legislation. And I do want to note actually that, you know, especially the consideration section of these of the template, we took into account what we learned from other states that were some of the early innovators like Connecticut, Washington, and others. So we definitely took that into account, but we also took a lot around the program design and implementation from similar efforts, especially the Children's Savings Accounts or CSA field, which I know I personally have worked on my 10 years at Prosperity Now, and Prosperity Now has worked on it for longer than that. And I do want to acknowledge the contributions of people in that field and helping us to think about, you know, kind of how to set up a program like this. So, so you can see for each section in the template, we have description, considerations, and examples. So here in this section 6 on eligibility, you can see first there's a description of what's in this section of the legislation, the purpose behind it. And I realize that type is very small, but you can go into the toolkit and look at it yourself. And then there's a section on what are some of the considerations for developing this section. So for example, we talk about, do you want this program to be universally, have universal eligibility or target eligibility? What's the difference? What are the pros and cons of each? We encourage people to consider whether different ways of doing eligibility, whether they're inclusive or not, or any barriers they might pose to participation in the program. We also encourage people to think through how eligibility fits with enrollment. So can the eligibility criteria that you're picking lend itself to automatic enrollment, which is one of the essential elements of a state baby bonds program. So then the next section we have are examples. So you can see we have examples from legislation in Connecticut and New Jersey, which both use different eligibility criteria to give people an idea of different ways this is done. So that just gives you a little bit of a flavor of what the toolkit looks like. There's so much more in it. We hope that you'll all dive into it and share it with other people, and that will be helpful for you in designing baby bonds programs. But now with that, I want to go into kind of talking about the application of this. So where is this, what's actually happening on state baby bonds? And for that, I'm going to bring in my colleague, Lauren Belor, who is the Associate Director for State and Local Policy at Prosperity Now. So welcome, Lauren.
Thank you. Thank you. So excited to have this fireside conversation today, Shira.
Great. Well, before we start our conversation, Lauren, I do want to ask our audience a poll question. So we'd love to hear from all of you about what activity you're seeing in your state around baby bonds. So Noah, if you can launch the poll, that'd be great. We'll give everyone about 45 seconds or so to respond. All right, I think maybe we'll close up the poll and share out the results with everybody. Great. So thanks, Noah. So so as you can see, it looks like actually we have a couple of people from states that have already passed legislation, which is exciting. A good number of people where legislation has been introduced, so they're seeing some interest bubbling up, and then some places where hardly anyone is talking about it. So this is a great opportunity for you to be the ones to raise it in your places. So Lauren, any thoughts on the poll?
I think this was anticipated and expected as far as the results. But I think this lends to the conversation. It's very clear that it's pretty even kill between legislation that has been introduced or being discussed and interest bubbling up, and that feels very timely for the moment. So again, very expected. I think for areas where there's hardly anyone is talking about it, I think that today's conversation will help lend to maybe pushing the conversation to the forefront in their states.
Definitely. Thank you. Yeah, Noah, can you close up the poll? Great, perfect. So Lauren, why don't we start by just talking a little bit about what activity are you seeing around baby bonds at the state level?
For sure. So we'll start with some of the model states and or municipalities that have already been listed, that have kind of been used as the examples for other states to pull from. So we'll start with Washington, D.C. The legislation was originally passed in 2021, and recently in 2022, there have been some technical fixes or just some additions to the legislation towards the end of 2022. And then at the onset of the year, we saw that the implementation just kind of went into effect and in progress. And they are looking to enroll the first set of children this year. So very exciting for DC. And I'll talk a little bit more about how municipalities can really use that as a power play in the future. For Connecticut, which is definitely seen as the model state, the legislation originally passed in 2021, but there's been a little bit of, I would say, debate over funding it. The governor signed the legislation and signaled that there was no intention of authorizing the state bonding needed to fund it. And it's important to note that this is how Connecticut chose to fund the program originally, so it doesn't have to be funded through a state bond despite the name. And so that's just important to note there as it relates to thinking about funding and budget, which I also will come back to later in this session. And then also too, the Treasurer Wooden, who spearheaded the legislation, has now left. But the good thing is the new treasurer, Eric Russell, does support the legislation. So again, these are good moves as far as progress moving in Connecticut as it relates to actual implementation. There is an active coalition of organizations in Connecticut on the ground working to try to get the funding for the actual program. So more to come on that. And I'll also talk about a little bit about how advocacy groups can form a coalition also later in our conversation. Lastly, as far as what has already passed, with California, they passed legislation in 2022 creating the HOPE accounts. And I just want to shout out Shira, who has helped to support California as it relates to the implementation as an advisor. But these are, the HOPE Act will be long-term investments for children from low-income families who lost a parent or caregiver to COVID or who are in long-term foster care. The uses will be more open when they're 18 and are not specific to wealth building, but it's a little bit different of how we would think about baby bonds as it relates to Connecticut and Washington, D.C. But still, it's giving a pipeline of wealth building opportunity to children from low-income families in the state of California. So there always could be revision there, but at least it's a foundation or stepping stone in that state. And again, the current status does include an advisory group, which again, shout out to Shira on that. I do want to turn to the legislation that's pending. So as Shira mentioned, it's very timely right now because many of these things were just introduced this week, but we'll start with Massachusetts. So the treasurer convened a task force to advise on a baby bonds proposal last spring and has worked with legislators to introduce baby bonds a proposal in January. Right now, the focus is on getting additional co-sponsors for the advancement of a hearing. So more to come on that. With Nevada, the treasurer proposed a baby bonds program in the fall, and the legislation was actually introduced last week. So there's a hearing scheduled for February 21st. Because of some changes in the landscape in Nevada that have happened post 2022 election cycle, it will be a bit of a challenge. But it's really going to come down to messaging and narrative, which we'll also get into later, as it relates to some of the split in partisanship in that state. For Washington, the Washington Future Fund, which is their version of what they call their baby bonds program, is currently pending in the legislature. And you know, I will hold on elaborating, since we have Jesse with us today, who can talk a little bit more about that, as far as where they are in the process and what we can expect from Washington. So that's just a little bit of the lay of the land of current legislation that has already passed and legislation that's pending. But looking forward to diving into more conversation about what we can anticipate in these next few years.
Yeah, Lauren. So yeah, I mean, that was my next question. Where else do you think there are possibilities for advancing baby bonds in the next few years?
So there's a couple of opportunities here, and I'm going to talk about not only where we can have legislation, but also where we can have case studies, which are just as important for moving innovative policy forward, like baby bonds. So we'll start with Maryland, since Governor Wes Moore opened the floodgates a little bit on that conversation in 2022. So on the campaign trail, Governor Wes Moore proposed the passage of baby bonds legislation as a means for closing the racial wealth gap. Moore proposed a baby bonds program that would seat about $3,200 for every child born on Medicaid, which amounts to nearly 40% of Maryland's infants, disproportionately impacting Black and Latinx families. Currently, the governor's administration is considering the legislation for next year, as earned income tax credit and the child tax credit expansion are kind of at the forefront this year. So there's more to come on that. But there are definitely advocacy groups on the ground in support of baby bonds, and it definitely seems to be something that is on the radar. So it's more of a more to come in the next few years. And, you know, that's why governors have 2 full terms, that we can see where things can be implemented. As baby bonds ramps up on the federal level and there's passage of legislation or implementation in more states, there were actually likely, or I foresee a likely more of a push for more case studies in the states, as well as municipalities. In 2022, we saw case studies on both the state and local level, on the state level being Louisiana and local level being the city of Detroit. In June of 2022, there was a request to the Detroit City Council to produce a report on baby bonds programs and provide information on cities in the United States that have implemented these programs. And with DC leading on the local level, there are more opportunities for localities to rethink their funding and budgets and advance the economic prosperity of constituencies directly. This also can be used as a defensive strategy tool, which I'm sure we'll come back to, and help combat any potential shift in partisanship control in purple or red states, giving more power to municipal leadership. Interestingly enough, Michigan is a state with children's savings accounts, or also known as CSAs, but as more messaging and narrative builds around the even greater impact of baby bonds and its distinction, we will likely see more states that already have CSAs consider baby bonds on the municipal level. Also last year on the state level, and it's important to note this because it is more of a red state in leadership, Louisiana introduced HCR 94, which would not create a baby bonds program, but instead a case study. And by studying the issue, it could help families in Louisiana as an essential first step. As we know, the power of baby bonds lies in its promise to secure a more prosperous future for children, and HCR 94 could lend to the opportunity for consideration for that. And it's going to be Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead,
Oh,
Shira.
sorry to cut you off, Lauren. I just realized we don't have a lot of time for this segment, so I really want to get to the question of how advocacy groups, I know many people on this call are from groups that do advocacy. How can they engage on baby bonds?
Yes. So, and I will try to do this quickly and not be long-winded. Just want to be informative. But there's a couple of ways that advocacy groups can engage or amplify opportunities at the state level and or local level contingent. One is our baby bonds FAQs. The reason I'm throwing that in there, in addition to the legislative toolkit, which Sherry, you already mentioned earlier in conversation, and is linked in the chat as well, is that people are still trying to grasp an understanding of baby bonds and the differentiation between children's savings accounts. So it's important to have advocacy groups act as ambassadors to help support championing the policy issue. Also, too, we have our social media toolkit on the website that also links to our legislative toolkit that has sample tweets and messaging that could be used. Additionally, is supporting legislative introduction. So many policymakers truly do listen to their constituents and advocacy groups' policy priorities, especially when there's added pressure. So considering a timely op-ed, if it aligns including your policy priorities and prepared to include on a lobby day, hosting a webinar and inviting policy experts on baby bonds from national groups or key states that have implemented baby bonds, also not volunteering, but sort of voluntold Shira, and utilizing her expertise. Also too, mentioning during coffee hours or town halls, and then also creating feedback loops with constituents in your area and hosting a listening session. And if baby bonds is more pressing in your state, considering putting together an advocacy coalition group. So those are just a few things, and also want to, if we have time, share, discuss some of the conditions or stipulations that might hamper baby bonds moving forward.
Yeah, we have about a minute, so yeah, go ahead.
Awesome. So some of the conditions or stipulations that might hamper the passage of baby bonds legislation includes partisanship power play. Unfortunately, it's a sad reality, but partisanship is more and more divisive in this new era of politics. So many times this holds up progress that benefits multiple constituencies and communities of different demographic makeups. But also messaging, and my colleague Yumhee will elaborate on this further, but building a solid narrative that works in different states with different political landscapes is vital to introducing innovative policy solutions like baby bonds, and also dollars and cents. And the pun is intended on cents. But realistically, funding and budget allocation play a huge pivotal role in what is made a priority in a state. So those are all things that could hamper. But again, if you use those tools from advocacy and amplification, it will help to propel the conversation forward on baby bonds.
Yeah, thanks so much, Lauren. That's really great. I did just want to add, because I know you mentioned a bit about the difference with CSAs and baby bonds. That, again, Prosperity Now has worked on CSAs for many years, and we do think that there's a lot of synergy between the two fields. So we don't want to say that we're in any way pitting one against the other. We just want to kind of talk about how do we maximize getting money invested for kids. That's really what we're trying to focus on. So I just wanted to add that. But thanks so much, Lauren, for this great conversation. I'm going to turn it over now to our Director for Marketing Campaigns, Yumhee Park, who's going to talk about how we talk about baby bonds.
Thank you, Shira. Thank you, Lauren. And I'm going to bring you back in just a little bit because I want to ask you a specific question. But to start about talking about baby bonds, as many of you already know, advocating for the specific solutions that you think are best can be competitive. So to start to answer the question of how do we talk about baby bonds as advocates, we're constantly sort of asking ourselves, how do we talk about any issue that, number one, is going to be captivating and authentic, two, ensures that many people see themselves reflected in order to build support for that issue, and three, that our issue advocacy is not leaving anybody behind or pitting issues against each other. So one tactic that we're exploring at Prosperity Now is by leading with shared values, because we know the most effective communicators, they don't engage in a battle of facts alone. They instead lead with shared values and then support their messages with facts. So really exploring those core values, those deeply held beliefs, that drive our actions and attitudes and really support for issues like baby bonds. So how do we identify the value during our advocacy or driving our advocacy? And we start to do that by asking the question why. Often we have to sort of continue asking the question why in order to get at that one word value. So let's dive into that question. And Shira and Lauren, that's the question that I have for you. I want to ask each of you, why do you care about supporting and advocating for baby bonds? And I'll invite the rest of the audience too to answer that question. But I want to bring you all up, ask Shira and Lauren that question too.
Sure, Yamhi, thanks for that question. I think for me, it's really about fairness and justice. This idea that kind of the economic situation that a child is born into, which is so much tied to their race or ethnicity, the fact that that will like affect their future possibilities in life, it's just something that just feels so wrong and so unfair and unjust to me. So that's really what motivates me.
Yeah, thank you. Lauren, what about you?
Yeah, no, I'm so glad you asked this question because I think I absolutely support what Shira has already stated. But I also think it's about, it's purely about opportunity. And I think that we, a lot of times when we're born into this world, our genetic code or our zip code tends to triumph over our genetic code, and it's just not really unfortunately, it's just not a fair system as it's socially constructed to be limiting to advancement of specifically of certain demographics and groups of communities of people. So I absolutely see baby bonds as as just opportunity and really giving people a pipeline of success.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I resonate with both of that. And I think for me, it's about fairness as well, or a lack of fairness that perpetuates poverty in very specific communities, especially communities of color and immigrant communities. So I want to ask that question back to the audience. What is the value that resonates most with you on helping all kids thrive? Why do you care about helping all kids thrive? And it looks like we have our results. Seems like the one that most people resonated with is when children thrive, communities and generations thrive. So that really speaks to the value of community building. We need to break the cycle of injustice from birth was the next one that got the most sort of votes. We need to break the cycle of injustice. So that really speaks to the justice value. And then, all kids need to be able to build wealth equitably, really speaks to the equity value as well. And then 34% also resonated with sort of the fairness value that Lauren, Shira, and I both all talked about. So these values, and we can go to the next slide, that we've identified together can be really the starting point of messages that are values-led and authentic to your personal and or organizational values. So once we identify the value that drives our advocacy, how do we translate that into, talking points for an interview or an email message or a speech that you're going to deliver on baby bonds? And one way that we can do that is by creating a message triangle that lays out, all these separate messages. So there's your core message, which is really like the thesis of what you're trying to say, the quotable soundbite that you want a reporter to make sure to include in a piece. The vision, it's the world that we want to see, a problem message, that is something that encompasses the impact on certain communities. We as advocates are generally really good at talking about the problem that we're trying to solve. Articulating that. And then the solution message, that is where you talk about the bill or policy that you're trying to push. And all of these messages then tie back in is rooted in that core value that you've identified. So this is sort of an example of how we did this as an organization using the values of fairness and justice. And I want to be clear that it's not necessarily about repeating those values as words in every sentence, but more so capturing the essence of those values in the messages that you craft. So the core message here, we are really trying to encapsulate fairness, right? So everyone should get the chance to build their financial future, not just the few who've been born into wealth. We talk about our vision. What's the world that we want to see? We want to see a world where anybody of any race, ethnicity, and economic background has the ability to build wealth, and enabling them to live with dignity and thrive. We spell out the problem and impact. And Shira and Lauren have talked about it extensively too. You need money to get money. When some initial wealth, without initial wealth to build on, babies from households with low or no wealth are going to grow up stuck in a constant cycle of lack of opportunity, while others are just, set up to thrive. And then the solution. We talked about how the American Opportunity Accounts Act was reintroduced yesterday. So this is sort of where you talk about the solution and why it fits in with this core value that you have. So to help also make it even more applicable, I want to show a TikTok that we created featuring our very own Shira Markov, talking about it in a way that leads with values.
Say one day you're playing Monopoly with some friends. Instead of the normal rules, one friend randomly gets to start with half of the bank's money, and they already own hotels on Park Place before the game even starts. Seems unfair, right? Unfortunately, that's the world we live in, where some babies start with a winning hand. Born into families with lots of wealth, they start out way ahead of the game. Other babies, especially those of color, are born into families without wealth and have a much harder time getting a financial start in their adult lives. That's where baby bonds come in. The government invests money for babies from families without wealth so that when they grow up, they have a little bit of money to get started in life, like to go to college, to start a business, or to buy their first home, making the game of life a little bit fairer. Click here to learn more about baby bonds. Together, we can make the game a little fairer and ensure wealth-building opportunities for generations to come.
So all of this to say, we also want to acknowledge that the political landscape of your state and constituencies are going to inform how you engage with baby bonds. So we want to ask this next question of the audience to get us brainstorming and strategizing of how to tailor messages effectively so that your respective audiences are going to really hear and resonate with them. So we want to ask you all, what values do you think drives the constituents and decision makers, either in your respective states or in the red and purple states? So we'll give folks about 15 seconds to answer this question. All right, let's look at the answers. And it looks like the winning one was freedom, which I've also sort of seen in other spaces. There's freedom, and the top two seem freedom and equity. But, I know we're running out of time a little bit, but I would love to continue to explore with this group and others about how we talk about baby bonds with that freedom value. And that's something that we will continue to sort of think about, noodle on, and collaborate with you all on. So thank you for talking values-based messaging with us. If you want more specific guidance on how to talk about baby bonds, again, check out the comms section in the state legislative toolkit. And we also released yesterday a comms toolkit to accompany the federal reintroduction of the baby bonds legislation. So be sure to check that out, spread the word on this important and promising solution using the hashtag baby bonds, and reach out if you have any sort of questions on how to frame this issue for your respective audiences. I want to keep us on time, so I'm going to pass it off to Shira at this point.
Great, thanks so much, Yemi. That was really great. I do want to remind everyone that we will have a Q&A later, so you can put your questions in at any time using the question box, and we will get to them later. So now to sort of help us get a perspective on how all these different things we've talked about, what's going on in the states, program design, messaging, how all that comes together, we're going to bring in Jessie Johnson, who is the Outreach and Community Engagement Director at the Washington State Office of the State Treasurer. So oh, there you are. Hi, Jessie. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Great. So I think let's just start, since most of our audience may not be as familiar with what's going on in Washington, just with a little bit of an overview about what is the proposal there around baby bonds and what the current status is.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me again. And first of all, I just want to congratulate all those that worked on the federal legislation that Senator Booker and Congresswoman Presley put out. That's really exciting to see that happening at the federal level. For those that are on the East Coast, good afternoon, and on the West Coast, good morning still. My name is Jessie Johnson, and I serve as the Outreach Director for the State Treasurer in Washington State, also formerly a state representative and city council member in my hometown. But most importantly, I'm a father, and so that's why I'm so enthusiastic about baby bonds and finding solutions to disrupt child poverty and reduce racial wealth gaps. Our state's policy, which is HB 1094 or SB 5125 for those that want to track it, we see it as a significant market-based approach to tackling generational wealth gaps and developing the future of our state economy. For those that don't know Washington State, we actually have about 40,000 babies per year that are born into Medicaid. And our Medicaid system for our state is called Apple Health. And so this bill is going to give them the opportunity and hopefully the wherewithal to participate in the critical systems of wealth generation over the next 2 decades and longer. Our bill right now has been put to the test, so to speak. We actually had an amazing month of January in the policy committees where we passed out of the House and the Senate with bipartisan support, which is pretty crucial when you think about Republicans actively supporting a Democratic bill, because both of our prime sponsors are Democrats. And the reason for that, though, is all the work that we put in the last year. This bill was introduced last year in 2022. It did not make it very far, but we actually set up a committee to work on the bill over the last year. And this committee consisted of folks with lived experience that have actively participated in wealth generation for their own families, also that have been impacted by intergenerational wealth gaps, and also folks from financial empowerment institutions in our communities. And so we brought these folks together, also tribes. We have a heavy Latinx population here in Washington State, especially on the eastern side. So we brought in folks from the Latinx community and the agricultural community, and we really worked on how this would look. And so what we did was we increased the starting amount from $3,200 per birth to $4,000 per birth. And so what we do in Washington State is we're calculating every birth. And again, it's about 40,000 babies per year born into Apple Health or Medicaid. And that's 1 in 2 births in Washington State. So every birth we put in an amount, which we increased to 4,000. And then we work with our caseload forecast council in our state to actually estimate what those number of births are going to be for that year. And we put that money into an account and we invest it with our state investment board over 18 years. And that is the amount that we will have. Now, one of the things that we really have to do in order to have the impact that we want is to also pass a constitutional amendment in our state, which would allow us to invest these dollars similar to our pensions. So right now, we can invest more aggressively through our state investment board if there's a constitutional amendment that would add in beneficiaries that experience persistent poverty. Because right now it's only for the ABLE program, for folks with developmental disabilities, or for our state pension system, where we can invest more aggressively the dollars for those folks. And so we're trying to add in a constitutional amendment that would allow for Washington Future Fund or baby bonds to invest more aggressively. So instead of that person receiving $12,000 to $15,000 by the time they're 18, they would get $25,000 to $30,000 based on our projections, and that's with a pretty conservative estimate. So we're trying to do both at the same time, which is why this is such a heavy lift. And so right now our bill has got to the fiscal committee, the appropriations committee for both the House and the Senate, and it has been kind of stuck for the last 2 weeks. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One of which, politically, you know, folks in state politics are working with a certain amount of money. The governor has his budget, the Senate has their budget, the House has their budget, and all three sort of have to merge. And so there's differences of opinion as to whether baby bonds should be part of our state's budget, in all three really, but particularly for the governor's budget. And so that's where we're really struggling, is trying to get some support in that space. Also, what I'll say is, you know, to add on to that is there's other proposals being considered, of course, across the state. And where does baby bonds fit? And so a lot of the work that the committee did was to raise momentum and raise, you know, support over the last year. We have like 50 organizations that have sent strong letters to the chairs of all the appropriations committees and to the governor's office saying, hey, this is a priority for our community. This is tribes, Latinx community, immigrant and refugee organizations, nonprofits, educators, everyone showing their support, but we're still kind of in this this flex where we're trying to see if we're going to get a hearing in the fiscal committee. So that's where we're currently at with the bill. And I know I could keep talking forever, but there's some more questions you probably have. But we're at a standstill right now with whether we're going to get a hearing in the next committee.
Yeah, I understand that's a tough place to be. But I want to make sure that people really, I know you touched a little bit on the Washington Future Fund Committee, but I want to make sure people really understood kind of what that process was, because it was a very thoughtful process. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about, you know, some of the people who were involved, and then what were some of the key decisions that you had to make in developing that legislation.
Yeah, and I'll take a step back quickly. So our state's treasurer came into office in 2021. It was the first Democrat elected in this position in over 2 decades. It's been a Republican office. And so he came in with this idea, actually, from speaking with folks like Dr. Derek Hamilton, speaking with, you know, Senator Cory Booker and others. And we are the second state to take this on behind Connecticut. And it's taken some time. Like, we started this process when he came into office, January 2021. And last year in 2022, instead of passing the bill, like I mentioned before, the bill kind of got stuck in the policy committee. The legislature provided $400,000 for our office to develop a committee to work on it, because they felt the bill was not fully baked. And so that's what we did. We put together this committee. I came in the position last June and really took on what the committee would work on. And some of the things that we had to figure out was the amount per child, how it would actually work, because in our state system, of course, it's probably all state systems, it's based on the birthing person or the mom, and it's not really based on the child when you talk about Medicaid. And so we had to make a decision as to, you know, whether we would start this actually literally at birth or at, you know, 0 to 1 years old when that baby is in the Medicaid system. And of course, some babies don't make it to 1 year old, unfortunately. So we had to take a lot of that into consideration. We also had to consider, you know, whether we would have a second means test. So are you automatically a beneficiary when you are in our Medicaid system, or do you also have to show that you're still in poverty at 18 years old because of what's called the gift of public funds for our state constitution, which says you can't just hand out money to someone that's not in persistent poverty. And so we had to consider that. Also, is there going to be a financial education mandate where a person would have to get some sort of financial education in order to receive the funds? And then another big decision, of course, was, are we going to try this constitutional amendment with the bill as a package deal, or wait for another year, which could also, you know, impact the dollar amount, the return on investment for beneficiaries. So all of these decisions are what our committee had to talk through in the last, I guess, 8 to 9 months. And so a lot of substantive, policy decisions, but also strategy. We're talking about a major bill that costs $300 million a biennium, and I guess dissimilar from the Connecticut bill, our bill is in our general fund, so it's not based on any sort of tax or how well the economy is doing. If this were to pass, this is an automatic account that will be set up, so there will not be a space or a place where the dollars will not be there. This is for sure going to happen for these beneficiaries because it's coming out of our general fund dollars. And so that's why it's so hard, I guess, to pass it, is because, the legislature feels the pressure, like they have to come through for these dollars. And so that's another part that we had to figure out with strategy, and then finally, how are we going to get Republicans and Democrats to sign on? In the last 8 months, we did monthly meetings where we went through this. I know, Shira, you were a part of a couple of those as well. And, our committee came up with some of those key decision points, starting with $4,000, also increasing the amount where you can actually take out the funds for home ownership, entrepreneurship, or financing your education. Those are the three purposes you can use the funds for. And we increased from just 18 to 25 years old to 18 to 35 years old. And so now beneficiaries have more time that they can take it out. We also removed the provision about a financial education mandate, because we did feel, after hearing from community, that may be a bit paternalistic, and instead we would provide or advocate for asset-specific training or financial coaching if that beneficiary would like to. And then the last thing that we did, I guess of many things, was we built in a little bit of a cushion by saying, like, hey, if we have these dollars invested now and the state investment board is going to invest it over 18 years, our team here at the state treasurer's office is going to do the best we can to return dollars to our state's pockets. And so we worked really vigorously to make sure that there was dollars coming in back to the state from how we invested other programs. And so, a lot of this was really towards passing this bill. And we're still working to pass the bill and address this problem of generational wealth gaps. But of course, it's a big push and a heavy lift. And so that's kind of where we're at now.
Great. Well, you did mention, trying to get, more moderates, Republicans on board. So I'd love to hear a little bit, thinking about what Yumhi talked about. How are you messaging, baby bonds to different stakeholders, and, the values that you're talking about, and particularly when you're thinking about trying to reach those audiences that maybe you wouldn't necessarily assume would be supportive of this policy?
Yeah, I mean, and that's a great question. So of course, the treasurer and ours plan was, we need to visit people where they're at. And so in the last 8 to 9 months, he actually visited all 39 counties in our state. And I don't know if folks have been to Washington State, but it's not like the East Coast. It's spread out. It takes 6 hours to get from where I live to, another part of the state like Pullman, Washington, which is close to the border of Idaho. And so you have to get across the state, and we visited all 39 counties, chambers and rotaries and nonprofit organizations and different spaces to talk about what are the issues that they're facing in their community. And some of the same things came up. You're talking about skyrocketing prices and inflation, but also you're talking about this folks moving out of the community and not returning since the pandemic, because businesses have shut down, because there hasn't been an injection of capital into some of those lower income areas of our state, and folks just leaving and kind of like and not returning. And so when we talk to local city councils and mayors and county officials, they stress, like, how are we going to make sure we can build up our state's economy while investing in folks that need it most? And so that's really what the messaging has been, is like, this is not only a return on investment for individuals, but this is a return on investment for our state's economy. And we're talking about, so I just want to give a really short example. So, there's a county in our state, Ferry County, for example, that over 75% of the population is born on Apple Health. This is agricultural community, Southwest Washington, close to the peninsula, and so it's a lot of farming and stuff like that. Folks that are kids usually move out and don't return to the community. And so what would it do to have people come back and buy homes and start businesses, and that kind of multiplier effect in those communities. We figured for our entire state, it could have from a 35 to $75 billion impact on the state's economy over the next 2 decades. If in all the counties similar to Ferry, we had people moving back and starting businesses and opening up homes and stuff like that. So these funds can not only impact beneficiaries, but also some of those rural communities where folks move away and seek other opportunities. And so that's one of the messaging points we had for Republicans, because of course in our state, more in the urban areas, more Democratic, and more in the rural area is more Republican and conservative. And so that was the messaging point, which is why we got so many Republicans to sign on to the bill. And finally, we talked about the investment, again, over 50% of births on Apple Health. This is impacting a large number of young people and really changing the trajectory of their life. And so we brought in educators and we asked educators in sort of like these focus groups, like, hey, what would it do to your high school students if they knew coming into high school they had $20,000 to $25,000 waiting for them after 4 years? And what would that do to their mindset in high school? And when some of our educators came to testify on the bill in the legislature, they talked about that very thing and how engaged and energized some of their students felt if they knew they would have these dollars waiting for them in this investment. So it's really crucial to get the folks that are credible in the community, kind of credible messengers to legislators. And in our state, and probably in most states, we're talking about parents, educators, business owners, tribes. And so those are the key groups we sort of collaborated with to make sure that the messaging got out.
That's great. Thanks so much, Jesse. Yeah, and I've been really struck by, both watching testimony in hearings and seeing the coalition group come together, how many different types of organizations and different types of people this bill has brought together. So it really shows the possibilities of who we can kind of get into a coalition on this. So thank you so much for all that great work in Washington. We're keeping our fingers crossed that we could still get that legislation through this session. And thanks so much for joining us. And we'll bring you back for the Q&A in just a minute. But thanks. So want to just very quickly, we are going to go on to the Q&A. So make sure you're getting your questions in. But I do want to quickly kind of let you know about some calls to action we have. If you'll go on to the next slide. So as we've talked about, so the federal legislation was just reintroduced. So we're asking people to contact their members of Congress and urge them to co-sponsor the American Opportunity Accounts Act. We want to get as many members of the Senate and House on there as possible to show the support for it. If you live in Massachusetts specifically, we have an action alert there to contact your state legislators to ask them to co-sponsor the bill there. And I know Joanna dropped that into the chat, so the link should be there. We're also asking all of you to share the legislative toolkit with your legislators and other advocates so we can encourage a lot of thoughtful process in the development of baby bonds legislation. And then help us get the word out about baby bonds. There's so many people who still don't know about this and why it's important. And so we've made it easier for you with sample messaging in our partner toolkit that we just put out. And if you're talking about this on social media, use the hashtag #BabyBond so we can see what you're posting. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to your questions, and Yumhee is going to moderate our Q&A.
Thanks, Shira. So at this point, we want to turn it over to you all to ask any questions that have come up for you during this webinar. And I'm looking at the questions in we box, and it's already we already have a lot. So I can start with the first question. We have a question that says, please share your insights and expertise about how to continue the urgency of state-level baby bonds amid the federal proposal.
Lauren, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I can chime in here. So, I mean, it's a couple of ways to think about this and keeping up the urgency. And we kind of talked about some actions that advocacy groups can take, including maximizing on media attention. There's just not a lot of course, the federal level is going to garner a lot of media attention because usually federal level officials tend to garner more name recognition and more clout. However, this can also be amplified on the state level as well through press and media opportunities. And that's something that we've encouraged to some states that we've already been working with that have recently introduced legislation. But using opportunities to tell the story, which is why I'm glad you asked Shira and I the question of why we even would want to advocate for this, not just because we work for Prosperity Now, but there's a narrative and there's a story. And Shira talked about her nieces, and Jesse talked about the fact that he's a father. Everyone has a story that they can be connected to. No one can say they don't know any children at all, right? So there's an opportunity to build a narrative and messaging. I think that's the most important piece when keeping up the sense of urgency in the moment.
And Jesse, I know you've been pretty successful about getting media attention in Washington. I wonder if you might briefly mention that. Uh-oh, did we lose Jesse?
I'm back. Sorry about that. I hit the wrong button. So no, thanks. I think one of the things we did early was there's a lot of local papers in Washington State and probably in most states. And we made sure on this, road show that the treasurer went on that we reached out to every local paper that we possibly could. And we actually got, I think it was 25 different stories about baby bonds, and happy to share them later. That kind of gives you an idea for what these looked like, these stories. But we tried to target different aspects of media. We also got a really good story in GeekWire, and talking about, in the tech space and sort of what the future of the workforce looks like and how baby bonds fits into that, because so much of it is aligned with this sort of entrepreneurial spirit, and people are going to have to start their own businesses and startups. And of course, Washington State is like is the startup state, startups everywhere. And so how baby bonds fits into that with the funding available to start your own business. And so we tried to do that, and we got a lot of op-eds. We also, in every community, tried to target folks that would write in letters to the editor about baby bonds. And it sort of fueled this, like, hey, this is not just a Republican or a Democratic proposal. This is a proposal for everyone. And so that was really exciting to see. And finally, the last thing we did was that actually, I think our chief of staff got the idea from attending the Prosperity Now conference in Atlanta. Was we got city proclamations, and sort of like this, hey, there's cities and counties that support. We got King County to do a proclamation, which is our largest county, Martin Luther King County in Seattle. And then finally, we got the city of Seattle and the city of Renton and the city of Tacoma to do a proclamation or resolution in support of baby bonds. And that's really been helpful because, hey, one thing that legislators will listen to is their own constituents and their own elected officials at a local level. So that's been helpful as well.
Excellent, thank you. That was very helpful. The second question that we have is, can you explain the difference between a baby bond and government-funded 529 account? Specifically thinking about Massachusetts, which already has the Baby Steps program, but new legislation for baby bonds. Shira, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can take that. That's actually complicated because that's actually 3 different things in there. So there is the baby bonds proposal, the 529 college savings account, and then the CSA program in there. So try to very quickly suss those 3 things out. So the 529 program, so all states have that, and basically it's a tax advantaged account for saving for post-secondary education. So families put their own money in, and they get some tax advantages for saving for college. These are disproportionately used by wealthy people. We see it as kind of a tax giveaway to wealthy people on the whole. But what a lot of states have tried to do is create these children's savings account programs to open up access and use that existing 529 platform to help a lower income families. So for example, in Massachusetts, in the Baby Steps Children's Savings Account program, if families sign up for that program, I might be getting the dollar amount wrong, but I believe that the state puts in $100 into the account. on families' behalf, and there may be some other additional money that the state puts in. So it's not only on families to do the saving. The difference with the proposed baby bonds program is definitely a difference of scale. So we're now talking about several $1,000s in the account rather than $100, and a much more targeted approach towards children from the lowest income families. So it's actually, the proposal is for kids who are receiving TANF, or whose families are receiving TANF, and so it's a much more targeted program. So there's a lot more details, but I think for the time we have, I'm going to leave it there. But I'm happy to answer questions offline if people want to know more.
Thanks, Shira. The next question I'm going to direct to Jesse again. How long did the process take to bring stakeholders together to obtain the results and outcomes that you provided?
Yeah, I think so. So again, I came into this process brand new. I started the end of last May, and I was pretty much told in the hiring process for this role, like, hey, your job is everything external to get us, a ton of stakeholders. And so I already had an idea to start kind of doing this community asset mapping, like where are assets in the state that can help us, that figure that they would like this proposal. And so I started with, again, who are our main folks that have influence at the state level. That's in our state, at least, that's tribes. That's our, one of our fastest growing populations, the Latinx community, because of the agricultural work that's happening in Eastern Washington. That's a big part of our state's economy. And then finally, that's educators. And so those are our kind of three big groups that I targeted to reach out to get support. And then, we had that, we had the funding from the legislature, the $400,000 to do a committee. And this committee, we interviewed starting in June for folks to be on. It's a 10-person committee, and interviewed folks with lived experience from financial institutions and all that. And they were finalized, I think, by the end of June. And so we started the committee work at the end of June, and that lasted up until the session started until December. So we had about 6 to 7 months of work with the committee after we had our team put together. And that work was monthly meetings, was doing some studies about who's going to have impact on legislators, helping us on our tour of counties with the treasurer, so that when he went out to the counties, it wasn't just him showing up at these nonprofits and these organizations and chambers, but it was actually the committee members introducing him to the community, so that we felt it was credible. And then finally, just having them start to get sign-on letters ready to go, policy action alerts and stuff like that, so that we were ready to go when session started in January. So that was a lot of beginning work, I think, to put the team together so it's the right people on the committee. And then once it was there, it was pretty organic, and folks just did a great job at getting the word out about the bill.
Thank you, Jesse. I'm going to direct this next question to really all of you, Shira, Lauren, Jesse. Are there any private programs that are being launched or being proposed that you all know about?
I know I've heard of some discussions. I haven't heard anything too concrete yet. I mean, it is a really huge undertaking, several $1,000s for kids, and 20+ year time horizon. So it is a tough thing for a private organization to take on. And I will say that we really do strongly believe that this should be a government program. So this is based on systemic racism, and it's a systemic problem created by government policies over hundreds of years, and there should be a government solution. That's not to say there isn't some role for private organizations too, but that's really our belief. But I want to see what others have to say on it.
Yeah, I completely agree. I was going to say the same thing, Shira. I think this is also an accountability opportunity. And I don't think that the accountability should be placed on private organizations to address things that public institutions should have really created, the problem they created themselves. So it wouldn't be something I would even encourage private organizations to take on. However, when you have that stakeholder piece, and thinking about building coalitions, I think those are opportunities for private organizations to weigh in but also making sure that we're including, sometimes private organizations can have larger resources, so making sure that we're including grassroots or voices as well, just because I feel like community groups get lost in the shuffle sometimes.
All right, so on that note, for the next slide, we wanted to share some additional resources, but we'll wrap up the Q&A. If you have any other questions, you can follow up with us, send us an email at babybonds@prosperitynow.org. But some resources to share with you. We recently updated the Baby Bond section of our website, so check that out. That has everything that you'll need. As Joanna has left in the chat, we have the legislative toolkit that we've been talking about during this webinar. We have an FAQ. We have the paper that we pushed out. We have an overview video, and then some info on the federal legislation that we talked about. But any other questions, you can contact us at babybonds@prosperitynow.org. On the next slide, you'll see that we would like you to visit our advocacy center to stay up to date with any advocacy efforts. Sign up for our email list, and feel free to join any of our networks, but our main network that we would like to push out is the Campaign for Every Kid's Future network. Stay tuned for other Prosperity Now webinars, including the Prosperity Summit Encore series, and please, please, please complete the survey at the end of this webinar. You can see our contact information here as well if you want to get in touch with any of us directly. Thank you everyone for coming to our webinar. Really enjoyed having you all, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one. Thanks everyone.